You're a servant in the Palace of Versailles, and it's 3 in the morning on a humid August night in 1682. You've been summoned to the king's private apartments, not the grand public chambers where foreign dignitaries bow and scrape, but the hidden rooms behind false walls where Louis XIV keeps his most carefully guarded secrets. Your hands shake as you approach the ornate door because what you're about to witness will shatter every myth about the Sun King's supposed divine purity. The sounds coming from within are unlike anything you've ever heard in a royal palace. There's laughter, yes, but also something else, something that makes your blood run cold as you realize that the man who claims to rule by divine right is engaged in activities that would make even the most depraved Roman emperor blush with shame. Before diving into these forbidden stories of royal excess, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. This is the story of how unlimited authority corrupts not just politically, but sexually, morally, and psychologically. The private chambers of Louis XIV weren't just rooms, they were laboratories of depravity where the most powerful man in Europe conducted experiments in human degradation that would define an entire era of French decadence. The name Louis XIV conjures images of golden halls, elaborate wigs, and courtly elegance, but behind the carefully constructed facade of the Sun King lay appetites so twisted, so insatiable, that they required an entire secret infrastructure to satisfy. We're talking about hidden passages, coded communications, and a network of procurers who supplied the king with whatever his darkest fantasies demanded. Let's start with the man himself. Louis XIV wasn't born a monster. He was carefully crafted into one by a system that told him from birth that his desires, no matter how perverse, were divinely sanctioned. When you're raised believing that God himself has chosen you to rule over millions, that every whim is a sacred command, the boundaries of normal human behavior begin to dissolve. By the time Louis reached his 20s, courtiers were already whispering about the king's unusual preferences. These weren't the typical royal affairs that filled the gossip of every European court. What Louis craved went far beyond simple adultery or even the elaborate seduction games that were considered normal among the French nobility. The king had developed what his closest confidants carefully termed special interests. These interests required very specific arrangements that could never be discussed in polite society, never recorded in official documents, and never acknowledged by anyone who valued their life and position at court. To understand the full scope of Louis XIV's perversions, you need to grasp the sheer scale of his power. This wasn't just a rich man with unusual tastes, this was the absolute monarch of the most powerful nation in Europe, a man who controlled armies, treasuries, and the lives of 20 million subjects. When such a person decides that conventional pleasures no longer satisfy him, the results can be catastrophic for everyone around him. The transformation of Louis from a relatively normal young king into something far more sinister began around 1661, when he assumed full personal control of the French government. The death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, removed the last restraint on royal behavior. For the first time in his life, Louis faced no oversight, no guidance, and no one with the authority to tell him no. That's when the private chambers began their evolution from simple royal apartments into something far more disturbing. The king ordered extensive renovations to certain sections of Versailles, renovations that were conducted in absolute secrecy by craftsmen who were sworn to silence under penalty of death. These weren't ordinary room modifications. Hidden passages were carved into the walls, connecting the king's private quarters to chambers that officially didn't exist on any palace floor plan. Special ventilation systems were installed to muffle sounds that might otherwise carry to neighboring rooms. Most tellingly, these secret spaces were equipped with restraints, exotic furniture, and implements that served no decorative purpose. The king's trusted valet, Alexandre Bontemps, became the gatekeeper to this hidden world. Bontemps wasn't just a servant, he was the architect of Louis XIV's most intimate secrets, the man who understood exactly what his master required and how to provide it without leaving any trace of evidence. Contemporary accounts describe Bontemps as possessing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the king's needs. He could read Louis's moods, predict his desires, and arrange satisfaction before the king even realized what he was craving. This wasn't mere competence, it was the skill of someone who had studied depravity as a science. But Bontemps couldn't work alone. The scale of Louis XIV's appetites required an entire network of collaborators. There were the procurers who scoured not just Paris, but all of France for individuals who met the king's increasingly specific requirements. There were the physicians who treated injuries and administered drugs that enhanced certain experiences. There were the craftsmen who created specialized equipment and the servants who cleaned up aftermath that must never be discovered. Most disturbing of all, there were the record keepers. Despite the secrecy surrounding these activities, someone was documenting everything. Hidden away in coded journals and encrypted correspondence, the true extent of Louis XIV's private life was being preserved for posterity. These documents, discovered centuries later in forgotten archives, paint a picture of royal excess that defies imagination. The king's preferences evolved over time, becoming more elaborate and more extreme as conventional pleasures lost their appeal. What began as simple infidelity progressed to elaborate role-playing scenarios, then to activities that pushed the boundaries of consent, and finally to practices that modern understanding would classify as torture disguised as entertainment. The psychological impact on those forced to participate in these royal fantasies was devastating. Court records, carefully hidden from public view, document a disturbing pattern of individuals who entered the king's service healthy and optimistic, only to emerge months or years later as broken shells of their former selves. Some never emerged at all. The mortality rate among certain categories of palace servants was suspiciously high during Louis XIV's reign, though the official causes of death were always listed as fever, accident, or natural causes. The truth was far more sinister, but it was a truth that could never be acknowledged without bringing down the entire system of absolute monarchy. The financial cost of maintaining this secret world was staggering. While French peasants starved and soldiers went without pay, enormous sums were being diverted to fund the king's private obsessions. Special budgets, hidden from even the most trusted ministers, paid for everything from exotic imported drugs to custom-built furniture designed for activities that have no names in polite language. But perhaps most shocking of all was how these private perversions began to influence public policy. Louis XIV's twisted private appetites didn't remain confined to his secret chambers. They began seeping into the very governance of France like poison spreading through a royal bloodstream. The king's need for increasingly exotic pleasures started shaping diplomatic relations, military campaigns, and even religious policy in ways that would have horrified his subjects if they had understood the true motivations behind their monarch's decisions. Take, for example, the king's sudden interest in establishing trade relations with the Ottoman Empire. While courtiers praised Louis for his forward-thinking diplomatic initiatives, the reality was far more disturbing. The king had developed a fascination with certain practices that were rumored to be common in Turkish harems, and he desperately wanted to import not just goods, but specific individuals who could teach him these techniques. French ambassadors found themselves receiving the most bizarre instructions. Hidden within official diplomatic correspondence were coded requests for the procurement of particular types of slaves, exotic substances, and detailed descriptions of Ottoman palace customs that had nothing to do with politics or trade. These diplomats, sworn to secrecy, became unwilling participants in an international network designed to satisfy one man's increasingly depraved curiosities. The king's military campaigns also began reflecting his private obsessions. Louis XIV's wars weren't just about territorial expansion or political dominance. They were opportunities to acquire new victims and new techniques from conquered territories. When French armies occupied foreign cities, special units would be dispatched not to secure strategic positions, but to raid private collections, interrogate captured nobility about their intimate practices, and identify individuals who might serve the king's special needs. Veterans of these campaigns later wrote cryptic memoirs describing orders that made no military sense, missions that seemed designed more for procurement than conquest, and prisoners who were selected not for their intelligence value but for entirely different qualities. These soldiers returned to France carrying more than just battle scars. They carried the psychological trauma of having participated in activities that violated every code of military honor. but it was the king's manipulation of the Catholic Church that revealed the true extent of his corruption. Louis XIV understood that his perversions needed religious justification to continue unchallenged. He began pressuring church officials to reinterpret certain doctrines, to find theological loopholes that could sanctify practices that would normally be condemned as mortal sins. The king commissioned secret theological treatises arguing that royal desires were divine inspirations, that resistance to the monarch's will was resistance to God himself. These documents, written by compromised priests who feared for their lives, provided intellectual cover for activities that grew more extreme with each passing year. Some clergy members attempted to resist these pressures, but they quickly discovered the price of moral courage. Priests who refused to provide the theological justifications Louis demanded found themselves accused of heresy, exiled to remote parishes, or simply disappeared entirely. The church hierarchy, witnessing these examples, learned to provide whatever religious rationalization the king required. The most disturbing aspect of this religious corruption was how it affected the sacraments themselves. Louis XIV began demanding that certain rituals be modified to accommodate his private practices. Confession became a tool for identifying potential participants rather than a means of spiritual cleansing. Holy Communion was perverted into ceremonies that bore no resemblance to Christian worship. Even the palace chaplains weren't immune to corruption. These men of God found themselves performing ceremonies that would have been unrecognizable to any legitimate religious authority. They blessed equipment that had no holy purpose, sanctified relationships that violated every moral teaching, and provided last rites to individuals whose deaths were neither natural nor accidental. The psychological toll on these religious figures was immense. Many developed what contemporary observers described as nervous conditions, strange behaviors that suggested minds struggling to reconcile their sacred vows with the unholy activities they were forced to witness and sanctify. Some began experiencing what they claimed were divine visions, though their descriptions sounded more like the ravings of men whose sanity had been shattered by prolonged exposure to moral corruption. As word of the king's preferences spread through coded whispers among European nobility, Louis XIV found himself in an increasingly powerful position. Other monarchs, terrified that their own secrets might be exposed, became surprisingly compliant with French demands. Diplomatic negotiations that should have taken months were resolved in days when the French king possessed certain types of information about his counterparts. This created a web of mutual blackmail that extended across the continent. Royal courts from Madrid to Vienna found themselves dancing to French tunes not because of military threats or economic pressure, but because Louis XIV's network of informants had uncovered compromising information about their most private activities. The Sun King had weaponized depravity, turning personal shame into political leverage. The golden halls of Versailles still echo with the ghosts of those who suffered in Louis XIV's private chambers, their screams silenced by centuries of carefully constructed lies about royal grandeur. The Sun King's legacy isn't just one of architectural magnificence or political achievement. It's a testament to how absolute power transforms human beings into monsters, how divine authority becomes the perfect cover for the most unholy acts imaginable. Every tourist who walks through those glittering rooms today is treading on ground soaked with the blood and tears of countless victims whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose suffering was erased from history to preserve the myth of royal nobility. The mirrors that once reflected the king's twisted ceremonies now reflect only sanitized versions of the past, carefully edited to hide the horror that absolute monarchy inevitably produces. Louis XIV proved that when you tell a man he's chosen by God, when you remove every check on his power, when you surround him with people who must say yes to his every whim, you don't create a divine ruler, you create a human devil. His private chambers weren't just rooms where a king indulged his appetites, they were laboratories where unchecked authority conducted experiments in human degradation that would make modern dictators seem restrained by comparison. The most chilling aspect of this story isn't the depravity itself, it's how easily an entire civilization convinced itself to look the other way. Thousands of courtiers, servants, soldiers, and priests witnessed evidence of the king's crimes, yet not one possessed the courage to speak truth to power. They chose comfortable complicity over dangerous honesty, personal safety over moral duty, and in doing so became accomplices to horrors that echo through history. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Louis XIV's secret life, that evil doesn't just happen in dark corners perpetrated by obvious monsters. It flourishes in palaces and parliaments, protected by ceremony and sanctified by authority, enabled by good people who choose silence over justice because the cost of speaking truth seems too high to pay. The next time you hear someone defend absolute authority, remember the sounds that echoed through those hidden chambers at Versailles. Remember that power without accountability doesn't create order, it creates hell on earth, dressed in silk and justified by God.